Okay, good afternoon, student Khatib. We have in this slide, we have the translation of metaphors. We have many definitions of metaphors. First of all, it could be a figurative expression. It's about the process of transferring sense of a physical word. Could be the personification of an abstraction, the application of a word or collocation to what it does not literally denote, to describe one thing in terms of or of another. Uh, Apolysemous words and most English phrasal verbs are potentially metaphorical. Metaphors may be single, one word, or extended, a collocation, an idiom, a sentence, a proverb, an allegory, or a complete negative or a complete imaginative text. The purpose of metaphor is basically twofold. It could be a referential purpose in order to describe a mental process or a state, a concept, a person, an object, a quality, or an action more comprehensively and concisely. Its pragmatic purpose, which is simultaneous, is to appeal to the senses, to interest, to clarify graphically, to please, to delight, to surprise. The first purpose is cognitive, the second aesthetic. Okay, now a metaphor is a kind of deception often used to conceal an intention. One of the problems in understanding and translating an original or an adopted and to a lesser extent a stock metaphor is to decide how much space to allot to the crisscrossed area of sense, and further to determine whether this area is positive or negative, connotative or denotative. Okay. Now in cultural metaphors are usually harder to translate than universal or personal metaphors. Okay. Translating metaphors, usually only the more common words have connotations, but at a pinch, any word can be a metaphor, and its sense has to be teased out by matching its primary meaning against its linguistic, situational, and cultural context. Now we have types of metaphor. Metaphor has text types: dead, cliché, stock, adopted, recent, and original. We have the first one, dead metaphors. Dead metaphors is metaphors where one is hardly conscious of the image, frequently relate to universal terms of space and time, the main part of the body. So the dead metaphors is the main, it's hardly conscious to the main part of the body, general ecological features, and the main human activities for English words such as space, field, mind, top, bottom, foot, mouth, etc. Normally, dead metaphors are not difficult to translate, but they often defy literal translation. Note that in English, at least, dead metaphors can be livened up, sometimes into metonyms by conversion to phrasal words. So we can say that dead metaphors, also called a frozen metaphor, which is a figure of speech that readers or listeners are so familiar with that to surprise an image in their minds, thereby becoming effective as an actual metaphor. Okay. The second type of metaphor is the cliché metaphors. Cliché metaphors can be defined as metaphors that have perhaps outlived their usefulness, that are used as a substitute or for clear thought, often emotively, but without corresponding to the facts of the matter. However, a translator should get rid of the cliches of any kind, collocations as well as metaphors when they are used in an anonymous text. Informative text, where only facts or theories are sacred and by agreement with the source language author in public notices, instructions, propaganda, or publicity, where the translator is trying to obtain an optimum reaction from relationship, from readership. Sorry for that. The third type of metaphors is stock or standard metaphors. A stock metaphor is an established metaphor which, in an informal context, is an efficient and conscious method um, of covering a physical or mental situation, both referentially and pragmatically. A stock metaphor has a certain emotional warmth and which is not deadened by overuse. Stock metaphors are sometimes tricky to translate since their apparent equivalents may be out of date or affected or used by a different social class or age group. The first and most satisfying procedure for translating a stock metaphor is to reproduce the same image in the target language. But a more common procedure for translating stock metaphors is to replace the source language image with another established target language image. If one exists that is equally frequent within the register, such one-word metaphors are rare. A drain on resources. Like it was translated into need the resources, and all these are rather inaccurate. A stock metaphor can only be translated exactly if the image is transferred within a correspondingly acceptable and established collocation. Okay? As soon as you produce a new image, however acceptable the target language metaphor, there is a degree of change of meaning and usually of tone. Stock metaphors in anonymous text may be omitted if they are redundant. I see no point in his sharp razor edge, his spirit mordant. Okay, this is like an example of translating stock metaphors in anonymous text. Okay. Now, translation of sense by stock metaphor is more common in literary texts, where it is not justified than in non-literary texts, where it may be so, particularly in the transfer from a rather formal to a less formal variety of language, or in an attempt to enliven the style of an informative text. Expressions like das ist here can be translated as that's the point here. There are various degrees of adapted stock metaphors, almost carrying calls to Newcastle, but since their sense is normally clear, the translation should err on the side of caution and comprehension. The fourth type of metaphors is recent metaphors. By recent metaphors, it means a metaphorical neologism, often anonymously coined, which has spread rapidly in the source language. When this designates a recently current object or a process, it's a metonym. Otherwise, It may be a new metaphor designating one of a number of prototypical qualities that continually renew themselves in language. Um, Recent metaphors designating new objects or processes are treated like other neologisms, with particular reference to the explorability of the different and the level of language of the metaphor. Last but not least, original metaphors, the last type of metaphors. We must now consider original metaphors created or quoted by the source language writer in principle, in authoritative and expressive text. These should be translated literally, where they are universal, whether they are universal, cultural, or obscurely subjective. Original metaphors contain the core of an important writer's message, his personality, his comments on life and thought, and though they may have a more or less cultural element. The translator can only follow the original lexically, since the metre will not quite let the grammar be reproduced. The metaphor is virtually a literal rendering, and the readers of each version are faced with virtually the same difficulties of interpretation. Okay? However, if an original cultural metaphor appears to you to be a little obscure and not very important, you can sometimes replace it with a descriptive metaphor or reduce it to sense. Evelyn Oxford, a place in Loven's, could be Oxford lost in the mythology of a remote, vanished region, or even in Atlantis. Original or odd metaphors in most informative texts are open to a variety of translation procedures, depending usually on whether the translator wants to emphasize the sense or the image. In principle, unless a literal translation forks or is mandatory, the translation of any metaphor is the epitome of a translation, in that it always offers choices in the direction either of sense or of an image, or a modification of one or a combination of both, and depending, as always, on the contextual factors, not least on the importance of the metaphor within the text.